Hey guys, what's up? Kryzarel here, and today we will be looking at tooltips. We are gonna make tooltips for our items and tooltips for our stats. Before we begin, we need to have an idea of what our tooltip will look like, what information it's going to display, and where it will show up on screen. I opted for a tooltip with a fixed position on screen, as opposed to one that follows our mouse around. If we were to do one of those, I'd like to solve the issue of correctly positioning the tooltip when we're near the edges of the screen to avoid getting it cropped off. But that's a topic for a whole different video. Regarding the information that each tooltip will need to display, for the item tooltip, we'll need the item's name, the slot that it belongs to, and all of the stat bonuses that it grants. For the stat tooltip, we need the stat's name, the base value, the final value, and all of the stat modifiers that have been applied. For the look of our tooltips, we have the details image in our items and inventory UI, download link in the description as usual, and we'll use this to be the background of our tooltips. Let's start by building the item tooltip. As you can imagine, both tooltips are very similar, so it doesn't really matter which one we start with. With a very small number of modifications, we can easily get it to look good for the other one. Create a new empty game object under our canvas, and let's name it Item Tooltip. Open the anchors window, hold down Alt and Shift, and this will set the anchors, pivot, and the position of the object to the bottom right of the screen. Rect transforms always grow away from their pivots, so by setting the pivot to the bottom right corner, this makes sure that if we ever need to resize our object, it's never going to grow outside of the screen. It's always going to grow inwards, towards the center of the screen. Now let's set an X and Y position. These values don't need to be anything fancy. You can just input anything that looks good for you. I'm gonna go with -50 and 50. So, because of the way we set our anchors, at the bottom right of the screen, it makes it so that these values are both relative to the bottom right corner of the screen. So by setting a value of -50, we're basically saying that we want our tooltip to be 50 pixels away from the right edge of the screen, and 50 pixels above the bottom edge of the screen. But let's break this down and fully understand how it works. When we set the position of an object, what we're actually doing is setting the position of its pivot. And this is true for 3D objects as well, although in 3D objects, the pivot is usually modified inside your 3D modeling software. So when we set our object to be at position 0, 0, we're actually setting the pivot of this object to be at position 0, 0. And with the default settings, where the pivot is in the center of the object, that turns out as you would expect, with the center of the object being placed in the center of the screen. But if we change the pivot of this object to the bottom right corner, without changing the anchors, which you can absolutely do of course, they are independent, you don't necessarily need to change them together, although usually you do, and that's why this screen kind of ties them up together. But you can also use these variables here to change them up individually however you like. Alternatively, you can use this screen and change both the pivot and the anchors at the same time by holding down Shift, and then setting just the anchors back by releasing Shift to the center. And if we set the object's position to 0, 0 once again, we can see that the bottom right corner of the object is now at the center of the screen. And these values here are essentially just percentages, so by setting the pivot to 0.5 and 0.5, we're saying that we want it at 50% of the object's width and 50% of the object's height, so it goes in the middle. But if we change it to 1 and 0.5, then we also need to change the setting up here to read pivot, and this way it shows the position of the pivot, while otherwise it would show the position of the center of the object, no matter where the pivot would be. So change it to pivot, and now we can see that the pivot is at 100% of the object's width, which means it's on the right side. So 0, 0 here is the bottom left corner of the object, 0, 1 would be the upper left corner, 1, 1 the upper right corner, and so on and so forth. So if we increase X values, the pivot's position moves to the right, and if we increase Y values, the pivot's position moves up. You can even set this to something like 70%, which is kind of a weird position, but you can do it if you'd like. Or even values that are greater than 1, where the pivot is outside of the object. And because objects also rotate around their pivot, that could be one possible useful use case for this. So now let's look at how the anchors work. While the pivot is sort of the focal point of the object and it is relative to the object itself, the anchors are relative to the parent of the object. In this case, the parent of our object is the canvas itself. So in essence, our anchors are going to be relative to the screen, because the canvas always has the same size as the screen. So if we change our anchors to the bottom right corner, for example, and we set our object's position to 0, 0, whereas before, when the anchor was at the center, we would be setting the position of the pivot to the center of the screen. Now that the anchors are on the bottom right corner, we are setting the position of the pivot to the bottom right corner as well. Now for our tooltip, when we set both the pivot and the anchors to the bottom right corner of the screen, and we set our object's position to 0, 0 by also holding down Alt, what we're essentially saying is that we want the bottom right corner of our object to be placed at the bottom right corner of our screen. And when we set our position, as we discussed previously, negative values on the X move stuff to the left, so we are telling it to move 50 pixels away from his anchor point. And when we set the Y position, we are telling it also to move 50 pixels away from the anchor point, but this time in the vertical axis. So let's finally get back to our tooltip. For the size, I'm gonna input some values that I think look pretty good. You can change this to your liking. Let's right-click our tooltip object and add a UI image under it. This is going to be the background image. As any background image should, this needs to fill the entirety of our parent object. So to do that, let's open the anchors window once again, hold Alt and Shift, and select the middle stretch option at the very bottom right of the window. The image we'll use for this is the details image of our items and inventory UI, so let's drag and drop it into the source image variable. Now let's create 3 text objects, one for the item's name, another for its slot, and another for the stats. Let's position these objects roughly where we'd like them to be. This really doesn't have to be exact at all, because we're just going to override their positions with a vertical layout anyway. Now I'm going to configure each one of these to something a little bit nicer. You obviously can customize this to whatever you like. I like the item's name text to have a size of 40 and color of white. For the slot text, I like size 22 and yellow color. And for the stats, size 28 and green. We can see that some of our texts have disappeared, and that's because they're too big to fit inside their own text boxes. We could easily fix that by just changing the size of the text boxes, but there's much better ways to do that. We'd like something that does it automatically for us, of course, and we can do that by adding a content size fitter component. We can change the horizontal fit and the vertical fit variables to preferred size, although in this case, choosing minimum size I believe would have the exact same effect. What this component is doing is basically figuring out exactly how much space the text that we've written here actually needs, and sets the rect transform size to be exactly that. No more, no less. For those of you out there that already know how to work with the UI, I do know that the content size fitter component will not work with a layout group, but I'm just using this to illustrate a point, so bear with me here. We can get some more useful insight into the behavior of the content size fitter by looking at the Unity documentation. The content size fitter functions as a layout controller that controls the size of its own layout element. Such layout elements can be image or text components, layout groups, or a layout element component. This is really valuable information when working with the UI, especially with layout groups. So what this is telling us is that even though there is a layout element component, individual text and image components are already layout elements themselves. So in reality, this text object already has a minimum and preferred sizes, they're just not exposed, they won't be shown to us. The layout element component just allows us to override those values. And by the same token, they're completely independent of the rect transform size. Only when using something like a content size fitter, for example, do we force the rect transform to actually assume the size of the layout element. So if we override the minimum width, for example, you can see that even though we deleted a bunch of text, the object's width won't go any lower than this value. But if the text that we have needs more space than this, it will still grow to fit all of that. And that's because we can override these values selectively. If we simply don't check the box of the preferred width, the content size fitter will still use the preferred width of the text object. But if we do check the box, then it's going to use whatever value we give it, instead of using the value that comes from the text component. And just to reiterate, this is completely independent of the rect transform. So if we remove our content size fitter component and change the values in the layout element, it won't have any effect on the actual size of the rect transform, because the rect transform doesn't care about the layout element size, unless something makes it care, like a content size fitter or a horizontal, vertical or grid layout group. Armed with this knowledge, we can finally add the vertical layout group to our item tooltip object. And that's all for today. We will go in depth into the configuration of this layout group in the next episode, so stay tuned for more, and I can't wait to see you next week.